Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So far we have discussed about directive principles of state policy to get an idea about social framework or idea of the framework of social policy in our country. Okay. Now, that was an internal document for our country. Now, actually, when we talk about the framework of social policy in our country, now we should also look at globally what is the framework of social policy globally, or what type of goals we have agreed upon globally. Is there any such document where globally there is an agreement on the framework of social policy? Or when you say social policy, what type of problem or solution of what type of problems come to our mind, or what type of problems we give importance? Okay. So, it will be meaningful when we discuss the framework of social policy. We should also look at globally and compare that what we thought is important problem for our country and what is the global thinking in this area. Now, for that purpose, what we'll do now, we will look at one important document which is Millennium Development Goals. As I mentioned earlier, let me repeat again, in the year 2000 or before 2000, when we were entering the new millennium, fortunately, all the states, member states of United Nations, they thought that we should have a common document, common developmental goals for all the countries of the world. And it is not one individual state, but all the member states of United Nations should try to attain these goals. Okay. And then they formulated a document, and it was said that all the member states of United Nations should try to attain these development goals by the year 2015. This document was adopted around 2000, in the year 2000, and it was said that by another 15 years, all the countries of the world should try to attain these development goals. And actually, United Nations also created a monitoring wing where regularly it was attempt was made to monitor to what extent a particular state is able to attain development goals, and also it was giving some assistance through this assessment that how to attain this millennium development goal. Though it was a voluntary type of arrangement, but this has certain value because all the member states agreed that these are very important. These development goals are important for all countries of the world. Now, to get an idea about the framework of social policy, it is very important to look into this document. And actually, as we are a member state of United Nations, we also agreed upon these goals. So that is one external influence which shaped the social policy framework of our country. Now, there are 8 developmental goals. Okay. Now, there are 8 developmental goals. Now, goal number 1 was eradicate extreme hunger and poverty. Okay. Now, that in other words, poverty alleviation, and actually we in our country also that is one of the goal of our social policy. Then goal number 2 was to achieve universal primary education. This we have already stated in our directive principles of state policy. So here that is in line with what we have decided already in our country. The goal number 3 was to promote gender equality and empower women. Gender equality, if you recollect, in our directive principles we have talked about gender equality and even something more. Then there are goal number 4, 5 and 6. These goals were broadly cover the area of health, which includes to reduce child mortality, to improve maternal health and to combat HIV, AIDS, malaria and other diseases. In other words, these goals were in the area of health. So in terms to have some sort of improvement in the health situation, and that also we have some social policy in the area of health. Health is one important area of social policy in our country. Then goal number 7 is ensure environmental sustainability. Unfortunately, we have not mentioned anything about environmental sustainability in our directive principles of state policy, or surprisingly in our country political parties they do not talk about environmental problem or environmental sustainability. And goal number 8 is to develop a global partnership for development. Okay, that is beyond this, but here actually we agree upon this. So you see that Millennium Development Goals is an important document, and actually what we find that whatever Millennium Development Goals were mentioned, most of the goals we agree, we follow, we try to implement in our country, okay, except the goal regarding environmental sustainability, where we have very little policy. Okay, so this is one document which give us some idea of social policy framework of the world as well as of our country, or this document help us to understand social policy framework in the international perspective. Now we will move to another document which is Sustainable Development Goal, and we will see what have been mentioned there. Now we will look at Sustainable Development Goals. As I mentioned earlier, we have discussed about Millennium Development Goals. Now it was agreed upon that all the member states of the United Nations will try to implement the Millennium Development Goal by the year 2015, and it is observed that many countries were successful to attain some of the development goals to a considerable Millennium Development Goals to a considerable extent. But after the year 2015, United Nations or all the member states of the United Nations arrived at another document which is called Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG. Earlier document was Millennium Developmental Goal, MDG. Now the document that has been agreed upon, which all the member states try to implement, is Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG. Now let us look at what are these goals. Okay. Now as I mentioned that in September 2015, General Assembly adopted this agenda, which it was said that by the year 2030 the 17 sustainable goals have been identified, which all the member states will try to implement. Now here actually the attempt has been made that to achieve sustainable development for, this is what is the is the main thing, that to achieve what is sustainable development, nobody should be left behind. As the goal of all the member states of the United Nations is to achieve sustainable development for all. Now, what are these goals? These are a long list of sustainable development goals, or SDG. Now, actually, let me first read out, because we should what are these goals. There are 17 goals, though this is visible, but I think there is no harm to read these goals. The goal number 1 is no poverty, then zero hunger, then good health and well-being, then quality of education, then gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequality, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, strong institutions, partnership to achieve the goals. The goals are too many, but if you notice, let us look at some of these goals. If you notice that goal number 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, these goals talks about these goals are about poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality. Okay, so these goals we already were there in Millennium Development Goals. And apart from that, partnership to achieve the goals. This was also there in the earlier document. Okay. Now, but what is interesting in this, that we have certain goals here like clean, which actually which covers. We have certain goals in this which are sustainable environment, which aims at having a sustainable environment. Like for example, the goal regarding clean water and sanitation, affordable clean energy, then sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, etc. You see all these goals, all these goals, earlier we had sustainable environment. There is one goal in MDG, but now that has been elaborated in terms of all this clean water and sanitation, affordable clean energy, etc., etc. Okay. Now, so you see, in this sustainable development goals, lot of emphasis is given on preserving environment. Now environment has become we have polluted environment so much that we will be facing a lot of problem in terms of, because of the environment pollution, and actually it is the responsibility of all the countries of the world to preserve environment. Now and that has to be done through collaboration among all the nations of the country. Okay, and that is why under sustainable development goals we have we find this type of goals which give emphasis on sustainability. Okay. Now, like for instance, some other new thing which we find here is, one is peace, justice and strong institutions, and another is industry, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure. These were not mentioned in Millennium Development Goal. So, what if we compare this Millennium Development Goal and Sustainable Development Goal, what we can say that most of the goals that we now that the member states now want to achieve are we have already agreed upon under Millennium Development Goal. So, this is in a way a continuation of Millennium Development Goal, and if we think of our country, we also agreed, we also mentioned about those goals in our directive principles of state policy or other documents. Okay, like goals regarding poverty, hunger, health, education, equality, gender equality, etc., etc. All these goals we agreed upon. Now, one or two goals which are new in this document, in this in the SDG, that is one is on industry, innovation and infrastructure, another is decent work and economic growth. These are somewhat new, which was not there in the earlier document, the Millennium Development Goal. But what is most important and which is very important, particularly for our country, there was one goal in Millennium Development Goal, which is part of the Millennium Development Goal, that was sustainable environment. There it means we should try to attain a sustainable environment. Now, that goal has been particularly elaborated in under sustainable in this new document of and quite a number of specific goals has been mentioned here, which covers about the environment, which talks about environment. And what is most important, particularly for us, is that we are very silent about this. In our country, in our country, hardly there is any political party which talks about environmental sustainability, though it is so important and it has been agreed upon by the world community that preserving environment is very important, and even there are many political parties in Europe, like Green political party, etc. Those political parties, they fight election only on environmental agenda. Okay, but what is very striking that in our country this is completely missing. Like if you go through the manifesto of various political parties which are available now, because we will be having our general election or we are going through that phase now, you will find hardly there is any mention in the manifesto of the political parties about environmental problem and how environmental problem can be solved. So, this is one lacuna which is very prominent when we look at this document. So, to sum up our this part of the discussion, what would like to say that we have identified certain policy goals for our country. Most of these policy goals are reflected in Millennium Development Goal or in the Sustainable Development Goals, which on which most of the countries or member states of the United States agreed upon, and we also agree with that. Only area, major area where we lag behind the world community or most of the countries of the world is in the area of environment, protecting the environment, improving the environment, and we should take or our policymaker should take proper note of that. We are trying to understand the social framework or the framework of social policy. Okay. Now, for having that understanding, so far what we have done, we have discussed about directive principles of state policy from our constitution, and apart from that we have looked into Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, which these goals were adopted by the United Nations. So, what can be assumed that there is a universal agreement among the member countries of United Nations on those goals. So, based on these documents, we were trying to get an idea about social framework or about a policy, or about the framework of social policy in our country as well as of the world, and we tried to understand how these two documents like SDG and or MDG or Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals how they got reflected in the framework of social policy in our country. Now, apart from these documents, there is one very important event happened in our country. This is a very important event. Nothing like this happened earlier. In the year 1990, there was a major policy change in our country. You know, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have in the 1990 we adopted new economic policy that has transformed that has brought a change in our policy framework, and this document is very important to understand the framework of social policy. So now we will discuss how this change has come about. So what we will discuss now, origins of India's market reform, how the state changed its mind. That is what we will be discussing now. We will try to understand, we will try to analyze how this major change has taken place in our country. Our country, when we started our journey as an independent nations, we said that we will establish a socialistic pattern of society in our country, and we were following that path from 1950 to 1990. All these years we are following that path. Of course, there are certain shift, certain changes from time to time in that path towards liberalization, etc., etc. But in the year 1990, there was a major change to market reform. We adopted market reforms. We adopted various measures of market reform that has transformed our economy or our economic policy. So now, and that has a lot of implication when you try to understand the framework of social policy in our country. And so what we'll do, we'll try to understand how this change came about in our country. Okay. Now, when we got independence in our country, we adopted a model for the development which is known as Nehru Model model. Nehru, our first Prime Minister, and Mohanlabis, who is a statistician and economist as well. So Nehru, in consultation with Prashant Mohanlabis, they developed they suggested some particular policy for the development of our economy, that is known as Nehru Mohanlabis model. We at the time of independence, when we became independent, we were trying to shape our economy following the Nehru Mohanlabis model, or which is known as, popularly known as Nehru Mohanlabis model. Now, what is this model? Now, soon after independence, India adopted the path of planned development, where public sector was to play a dominant role, you know. Now, when we got independence, in front of us, on the one hand, there was capitalist capitalist nations. On the other hand, there was socialist nations. Capitalist nations. The leader of capitalist nation was United States of America, and another bloc or other model was the Soviet bloc, which was leader was Soviet Russia. Okay, so we had two development model present in our before us. One was the socialist model of Soviet Russia. Another was the capitalist model of United States. Okay, we had these two models, so we had to choose from these models. Now, what Pandit Nehru, our first Prime Minister, said that we will not follow any of this path. Neither will follow a purely socialist path following Soviet Russia, nor we follow the purely capitalist path following United States of America. We will take best from the both. We will take best from the both, and what we will do, we will follow a path of mixed economy. That means we will try to adopt whatever is good in socialist economy, we will adopt that, and we will also adopt whatever is good in the capitalist model, we will adopt that, and we will have a mixed economy, and that is how we will shape our country. So, we opted for a mixed economy. Now what was the shape of this mixed economy? In this mixed economy, if both public sector and private sector will play an important role. If we had followed the capitalist path, we should have given more importance to private sector. If we had adopted socialist path, we should have given more importance to public sector, and for capitalist path we should have given more importance to private sector. But what we said that in our economy, public sector and private sector both will have a role to play. Now, it said that public sector will play an important or dominant role in our economy. We said the public sector will play a dominant role, an important role in but apart will private sector will play a role, but public sector will play a dominant role. What will be that role? The Nehru model of industrial development emphasized the development of heavy industry under the public sector. What it suggested that how public sector, what type of role it will play? It will play a dominant role. What is that role? That role is that public sector will take care of heavy industries. Public sector like steel plants, machineries, all these will be manufactured in the public sector. Okay, that is how after independence we had the steel plants in Bhilai, Rourkela, Durgapur, etc., these places. Now, this model where these heavy industries were set up, and these industries are set up following this model where we gave importance to public sector. Public sector will be engaged in heavy industries, and it was said that it was thought that private sector will not have that type of capital or capabilities to set up this type of heavy industries. We for industrialization of our country, we need we need to have heavy industries. We need to have industries which will manufacture machineries, and we should have factories for steel plants, etc. So, state will take care of those, okay, and state will cater to the private sector. When private entrepreneur they want to set up an industry, they would need machineries, etc., etc. So that they can get from the public sector. Okay, that was the idea. Idea was that public sector may not have, private sector may not have that type of resources that was required for setting up industries. So private sector, so public sector will set up heavy industries, and they will cater the need of private entrepreneurs. Okay, this was the idea, and with that idea, those type of steel plants, heavy industries were set up by the government in various places. And another important thing was done here, that domestic industry was protected from foreign competition through high tariff walls, exchange rate management, and control of licenses. Like first of all, development of heavy industries were given to public sector, and because the public sector will be serving private sector, when private sector will require machineries, etc., they will get from public sector. Apart from that, there is another support which was given to the private sector, was that the private sector, when they will manufacture certain things, and when they want to sell those things in the market, if some foreign manufacturer or foreign operator, they would like to come and sell their goods in our country, there will be some restriction, because it was thought that being a newly independent state, private entrepreneurs of our country may not be able to compete with global player or international competitors. Hence, when some countries from the abroad, they come to our country to sell their goods, government will impose high taxes, so that private entrepreneur or private sector in our country is enabled to compete with them, because then private sector in our country will have some price advantage, and they will be able to compete. So some sort of protection was provided by the state to the private sector. So this way, actually it was thought that government will play a role to promote industrialization in our country and to promote private sector. This was the idea. Actually, when we got independence, our country was highly agricultural country. It was thought that how could we emerge as a developed country? We saw that all the developed countries are highly industrialized nation. So it was thought that to emerge as a developed country, we should industrialize our country as fast as possible. So it was thought that industrialization should get priority. So if we want to emerge as a developed nation, we should give priority to industrialization. Now, how we should go for this industrialization? In this industrialization, in the process of industrialization, public sector will play a very important role. In other words, government will play a very important role in promoting this industrialization. How government will play a role promoting this industrialization? Government will set up public sector heavy industries, and these heavy industries will basically provide support or provide supporting infrastructure to the private sector, so that private sector can flourish, and apart from that, private sector also will be provided some sort of protection, so that they can compete with other countries. They can become a successful entrepreneur, etc., etc. So this was done, and in fact, if we look back at that point of time, it was very wonderful thing. In fact, if we these townships, those were created, like say for example, if you ever visited, if you have some idea about say Durgapur, Rourkela or other cities where these heavy industries were set up, these were a model, and one of the goal of government was that this public sector industries should work as a model for private sector to evaluate. Like it was said that this public sector industries will provide all the facilities to their workers, and this public sector industries will provide better quality of life to the workers. There will be less exploitation, they will get all type of facilities, etc., etc. Now, why that was done? One of the goal of this was that private sector should try to follow that model, that was the idea then. Of course, that did not work the way it was emerging then. That is a different story. Not only that, another interesting thing to note, that when we set up this public sector industries, it was realized that we need professional engineers or professional managers, and as a part of that time government also thought of setting up institution like Indian Institute of Technologies, or Indian Institute of Management. It is interesting to note that this type of superior educational institutions were set up then. The idea was that this institution will fulfill the need of professional engineers, qualified engineers, who would serve the manpower need of the public sector industries, or who will manage this this public sector. Like say private industries, what they used to have, it was usually managed by family. It was private industries were family managed industries that time. There is no professional managers, but when private public sector industries were set up, a need was felt for having professional managers. To meet those needs, government that time thought of setting up Indian Institute of Management, etc., etc. Now, why I mentioned about this, what I'd like to mention, that those public sector industries later on, due to several reasons, did not become very successful, but if we look at the other part, this educational institutions, that this educational professional educational institution for having professional managers, professional engineers, those institutions still remain world class institutions. At least their Nehru model worked, and that was very successful. Of course, there are complaints about brain drain, or most of the graduates from these elite institutions are going abroad, etc., etc. Those type of problems are there, but these are still an excellent institutions, and these institutions are producing and flourishing and producing very efficient engineers and managers. Anyway, that was slightly different story, but through this public sector's prominent role, an attempt was made to promote industrialization in our country. Okay. Now, what are the other things? But then there are some change, some change happened in this process. What happened? In the year sometime in 1960s, we confronted there was a crisis in the agricultural sector. We had almost famine type situation, food crisis, agricultural production declined in 1960s, and we had to import food grain from developed countries. So this was a that happened in 1960s. So this was a setback. This was a setback for this type of model. Like we are trying to promote industrialization, and in that we assigned important role to public sector, and we thought through that we will promote industrialization. And we thought that time the rough idea was like this, that when industrialization will happen, lot of people will get employment in these industries, and when people get employment in industries, when the process of industrialization will start, what will happen? People from the rural area will migrate, and they get employment in industry, and when that happens, when people get employment in this industry, population pressure on agriculture will become less, and in that process agriculture will become more profitable. In our country there was a high population pressure on agriculture, and that is why that was thought one of the reasons why agriculture was not very profitable. Now it is thought if industrialization happens through the way it was suggested by Nehru model, following that process, if industrialization happens, where public sector will promote industrialization, and promote industrial activity by private sector also. Through this type of industrialization, people from rural area will move to urban area, and they will get employment, and agriculture will flourish. And in that process we neglected agriculture sector, and as a result of that, there was in the mid 60s there was a crisis in the agriculture sector. Food production hampered, and it was so serious that we did not have enough food for the population of our country. So we had to import food. So then, so this was a discontentment about this Nehru model. Economists started criticizing this, and we are trying to analyze why this crisis happened, where we had gone wrong. Now here actually there are two different type of analysis. Now there are some policy makers who like one was headed by T.T. Krishnamachari. He was a pro-socialist economist. Now he said actually we have to strengthen the state's role in India's mixed economy. He said this is his Krishnamachari and his group, their analysis was we have failed to strengthen state's role in the mixed economy. In the mixed economy, both public and private sector will play important role, but this, according to this analysis, actually we are not very successful implementing land reform. We were not that much successful to implement anti-monopoly legislation, and we have not nationalized many industries. That means, we were supposed to, according to, we are supposed to follow a socialist path, but where state role should be strengthened. We were not able to do that, and that is why this crisis. Actually, they said that they thought that one main reason why agriculture crisis we have in our agriculture sector, because we did not make much, state could not implement land reform. Okay, that was one viewpoint. But then there is another group of policy makers. Their analysis was different, and this group was led by important policymakers like C. Subramaniam, M.S. Swaminathan, I.G. Patel, S. Bhutalingam, etc., etc. Their analysis was different. They said that no, actually the type of crisis that we have faced, it is not due to our failure to implement land reform, etc., etc. It is due to actually our failure to have agriculture reform based on technological innovation and market incentives. They said actually agriculture failed because there is not enough market oriented incentive to the farmers to produce, and there is lack of technological innovation. So we should follow that path, then only could have overcome this type of crisis that we faced in the agricultural sector. And actually foreign donors, they supported the second viewpoint, and ultimately actually this viewpoint of agriculture reform that prevailed. It is very interesting to note, when we had this type of crisis, ultimately what happened, that we adopted agricultural reform. In fact, high yielding varieties of seeds were imported, and new technologies were introduced in agriculture, and that ultimately resulted green revolution, and we could overcome the food crisis that we are facing. So what happened, these two types of analysis was there. Ultimately the group which recommended that we should have technological innovation and market intervention, that group prevailed. Of course, there is a setback for some time, because American President Johnson refused to give food aid to India when India was facing a famine type condition. So that was a setback that we faced. That was setback for pro-liberalization groups, because when we depend on United States of America for importing food grain, and that was refused when we are facing a famine condition. So anyway, that was a setback, but otherwise still the pro-liberalization group prevailed, and ultimately we could overcome this food crisis through adapting by giving through technological invention and market incentives. Okay, that happened in 1960s. Okay, slowly we are we are going towards market reform. That process started in our agriculture sector in 1960s. We are not talking about that much of land reform, etc., but we are talking about market incentives, and high yielding varieties of seeds, etc., were introduced following that theory. Okay. Then again in the 1980, there is another problem. This was a problem in the 1980s, an alarming drop in India's industrial growth happened, and that questioned the Nehru Model. Nehru Model which we are following, it faced challenge again in 1980s when there was an alarming alarming drop in industrial growth. Now what that happened, there are three analysis or three standpoint on that, why this crisis in industrial growth. Now there are three standpoint. One standpoint says they were in favor of state's role in industrialization. They said they emphasize that state should play more important role in the industrialization. So they said that actually this crisis happened because redistributive change is required, etc., etc. Because they were more belong to the socialist school. They said actually states should play more important role in bringing redistributive change in the economy, and then we could have averted this type of crisis. So they were saying that in Mohan Nabi's model, whatever it was suggested, we were lacking there, because we are not giving that much important role to state. That was one viewpoint. The another viewpoint, the second viewpoint was that was selective liberalizers. Some other policymakers, they said actually, why we have this type of crisis in the industrial sector. This is because we have more state control. That is what is hampering our process of industrialization. So what is required? They said that actually we require more market oriented modifications, more liberalization. They said that actually this type of crisis in the industrial sector happened because state is intervening too much in the process of industrialization. So we should liberalize our economy, we should free our economy from the state control selectively, if not everywhere, but some selectively we should try to liberalize some part of our economy, that would help us to avoid this type of crisis in the industrial sector. And then there is a third group, that is market radicals. They said that we should have much more liberalization in our entire economy. They were market radical. They said no, actually we could avoid this type of crisis, or we could overcome this type of crisis if we have overall liberalization of our economy. Okay. So these are the three standpoints. One was pro-capitalist standpoint, one was pro-socialist standpoint, and another was somewhere in between. One school said that state should play more important role, that would help us to overcome the crisis. Another school said no, market should play more important role, that would help us to overcome the problem of that we faced in our industrial sector. But there's another school in between which says that actually state should play some role, but we should also liberalize some part of our economy. Okay. Now what happened, those who were in favor of more important role of state, they became marginalized in the policy making process, like in persons like D.P. Dhar or P.N. Haskar. They used to play a very important role in our policy making, but they became marginalized. They were not able to play important role in the policy making. Okay. And on the other hand, some senior civil servants, those who had pro market views like L.K. Jha and others, they were promoted. They started getting important position in the policy making. Okay. And now so what happened, this type of three types of standpoint was taken. The pro state, one was some policymakers say that state should play important role, some policymakers said no, market should play important role, and some others says no, the state should play some role, but also we should give some importance to market, etc., etc. But out of that, what happened, those who were taking, those who thought that state should play important role in the process of industrialization, they became marginalized, and those who were supporting market reform, those type of policy makers or senior civil servants, they somehow started getting importance in our economy. But actually, though they were talking about market reform, etc., etc., they are talking about liberalization of our economy, but they did not talk about privatization, or they did not go for cutbacks in public investment, etc., etc. Though they were pro-liberal, but they did not say that we should try to privatize or trade should be liberalized, etc., etc., and they avoided cutbacks in public investment. That means, out of all this debate, we were going towards liberalization in the 1980s, but with some restrictions. Okay, one important source of this restriction was nationalism. Why the idea of nationalism played very important role, because we have a colonial past, and we were exploited by our British colonial masters. Now, because of that experience, we were very suspicious about foreign powers, and we had a strong opinion about to protect national interest. So nationalism was very strong. The feeling of nationalism, that we should try to protect our national interest, that if we allow foreign investors to come to our country and play an important role, what may happen, we may be exploited, and that may not be good for our economy. We can liberalize our economy, etc., etc., but we should try to promote our national interest, and nationalism is very important. So our economy suffered because of exploitation in the past by our colonial master. So that should not happen, and we should protect our national interest. So what happened, before 1991, we started moving towards liberalization, but this was restricted by nationalism. We thought that time self-reliance was central to our economy, that we should try to become a self-reliant nation. That is what was the predominant viewpoint in the 1980s. Okay. Now, but then what prompted the change? In 1991 there was a drastic change in our economic policy. But what has prompted that? The first thing, there are many factors which prompted that change. One was crisis. In 1990 or late 1990, we faced an acute balance of payment crisis. In our country, we were in a balance of payment crisis. Now, for coming out of that crisis, we had to depend on help from IMF or World Bank. We had to take loan from IMF and World Bank, because the type of balance of payment crisis we had, we had to get a huge amount of loan from World Bank and IMF. Now, when we asked for that type of loan, it was suggested to us that we have to do some structural adjustment, and radical market reform we have to adopt, following what is known as Washington Consensus Model. World Bank and IMF suggested that they will give us loan provided we follow we adopt some radical market reform, and we bring some sort of changes in our economy. Okay, so now that was one thing. So to overcome this crisis, we had to, and they suggested that we have to reform our economy following what is known as Washington Consensus Model, which basically involves privatization, globalization, and liberalization. They suggested that we should go for more privatization, more liberalization, more globalization, etc., etc. They suggested that if we do that, then we can get loan under those conditions. Okay, and that was one thing which prompted us to adopt that change. But apart from that, we also had some learning. What is that learning? That we were a pro-socialist state, and Soviet Union was a model for us, the type of Nehru model that we had, that we are following in our country, that was influenced by Soviet Union. In a Soviet ideology, we are impressed by the industrial model of Soviet Union, and so we are following that model. Now, what happened? By that time we saw that that Soviet economy itself is collapsing. Soviet economy, which was a socialist economy, that itself was collapsing, which was our model. Then we started having a second thought, that should we follow this socialist economy model where state plays a very important role. So we started having a second thought, and also we saw around the world that welfare state were declining. Across the world, in many countries, state were started playing lesser and lesser role in providing state welfare. That was another experience. One was collapsing of Soviet Union. Another was decline of welfare state, and also we saw that some of the countries of East Asia, like Hong Kong, Singapore, etc., in these countries, they actually opened up their economy and they adopted market reform, and they started becoming prosperous country. They started prosperous. Their economic growth was very high, etc., etc. So because of this, when we saw from this learning, we had a second thought, that should we follow the Nehru model where state plays a very important role, because what we see that withdrawal of the state from the economic affair is showing some good result for some countries, or where state was playing important role. That country is facing problem. The countries which adopted market economy, those countries are prospering, etc., etc. So this was one important learning we had, looking at the development that was happening in the world around us. And apart from that, there was another thing, that was the person or men. Now, new economic policy was masterminded by a small and cohesive pro-market team, many of who worked in either in the World Bank or IMF prior to their government appointment. What happened, that in our government there are many senior, there are many policy makers, or they form a pro-market team. The economists, those who are playing important role in policy making in our country that time, many of them before joining as a policy maker with the government, either they worked in the World Bank or they worked in the IMF, and they were very much in favor of pro-market reform. So these three factors, so obviously they were trying to have pro-market reform. So actually, due to these three factors, one is the crisis that we faced due to balance of payment crisis that we faced, and whatever we saw around happening around us in the world, like collapsing of Soviet Russia and prosperity of East Asian country after adopting market oriented reform, and withdrawal of state social withdrawal of welfare statism. Along with that, this personnel or important policymakers who formed a pro-market team, these three together prompted a change, and ultimately market radicals movement of Trump arrived in 1991. Now, So what happened, this market radicals got commanding positions in the formal government hierarchy, most notably in the Prime Minister's office and Minister of Finance and Commerce. What happened, those who were market radicals, they got appointment. They were appointed in the government Prime Minister office and in the Finance Ministry. Okay, so they obviously they suggested they could prevail to carry forward market reform. Now, not only that, this type of market radicals were those who are pro market economists. They were not only in the government, there are many other research institutions outside the government. They also they were holding important position in those organizations also. And so actually government and outside agencies, they were our agencies which are outside the state, they started influencing policy pro market reform. And actually another important thing happened, by the time the new breed of entrepreneurs emerged, like earlier government was trying to protect the entrepreneur or protect the businessman from competition from abroad, and that this group of businessmen, they were influencing government to get more and more protection from the government. Okay, now this was one type of entrepreneur. But what happened by 1990s, we have some new breed of entrepreneurs. They were not afraid of competition from abroad, like those who operated in the IT sector or those who operated in pharmaceutical industries. So this type of many new entrepreneurs emerged, and they did not care for government protection. They were ready to compete globally. Okay, that was one thing. And another thing was actually consumerist middle class. They also played very important role. Consumerist middle class emerged. They wanted various type of foreign goods, etc., etc. And so this group also were not in favor of having restriction on having free market, etc., etc. So all these actually ultimately prompted market reform, that market oriented reform that we had in 1991. So in 1991 we adopted new economic policy following the Washington consensus model. This model was promoted by IMF and World Bank, and according to this model, government was advised to liberalize domestic product and markets through privatization and deregulation. Okay, so government were advised to go for liberalization and privatization and deregulation. The major significance of this Washington consensus model was that here the earlier argument was that whatever policy failures we had, there are internal reasons. Earlier we saw that we are poor. One viewpoint was that we were poor because we are exploited by foreign power. Okay, but under this Washington consensus model, what has suggested that our economy failed because of not exploitation by other countries. It was because of due to the internal policy failures. That was also one important thing. Actually, nationalism used to play a very important role earlier. Because we were very much we tried to protect national interest. We did not allow globalization type of policies. But now because we thought that actually because we are exploited by foreign powers, that is why our economy could not prosper. But now actually it was this, under this model, that was overlooked. They said that our economy suffered because of policy failure, internal policy failure. Okay, and ultimately what happened, that it resulted reversed the influence of statist economic strategies in developing the country. So far the policy we followed, where actually here in this model, state was controlling the economy. State was playing very important role in controlling the economy. Now a process started where we are trying to reverse that. Reversing in the sense that firstly privatization. Many things which was owned by state, run by state, were privatized. Then liberalization started happening, okay, and globalization started happening, okay. So what is happening? What started happening in 1991 under the new economic policy? The state started withdrawing from the economy, and we started that process so that state play minimum role in many areas, including the mainly in the economic area, and market started playing important role under this new economic policy. Now there was a paradigm shift here. What is the Nehru model, which we started in 1950. This Nehru model, in that Nehru model, as we have pointed out earlier, public sector was to play a dominant role, okay. Then second thing, the development of heavy industries under public sector, that was suggested under Nehru model, and domestic industry was protected from the foreign competition. This was the model of our development when we started industrialization in our country in 1950s. And in the 1991, by 1991 we adopted Washington consensus model. How we adapted this model we have discussed in this session. Now what this model basically suggested: liberalize domestic product and markets through privatization and deregulation, reverse the influence of the statist economic strategies. In other words, privatization, globalization, liberalization, we started adopting. This is how our economy, there is a total paradigm shift that happened in our economy 1991. Okay. Now what is the significance of this? Like now let us try to link this development with whatever we have discussed earlier. Like on the one hand, we have, when we were trying to understand the framework of social policy, we have seen that we agreed that poverty, inequality, illiteracy, ill health, malnutrition, these are the serious problems that we have in our country. Okay, and we agreed that state should play an important role here. That is how we have several policies where state, there are welfare program by the state, where state tries to address the problem of malnutrition, problem of illiteracy, problem of ill health, etc., through several policies. Okay, on the one hand we have that. On the other hand, we have adopted a model where we say that state should withdraw from most of the economic activities. Okay, so we should adopt a reform. We should reform our economy where state will have minimum role. So we have both. On the one hand, we suggest that state should play some important role in some of the social problems that we have to solving this problem. At the same time, we also adopted a policy or agreed on a policy where state should withdraw from economic activity. So, in other words, we can say that we should go for market reform, but we should go for market reform with to quote the popular term, we should go for market reform with human face. That on the one hand we should go for, obviously we should go for market reform, but this market reform should have a human face, in the sense that we will go for market reform, but we should also try to solve, the state should try to solve or address the problem of poverty, problem of illiteracy, problem of ill health, etc., etc. So, we should have both. On the one hand, state should have minimum role, on the other in particular in economic affairs, but in the social sector, state should play an important role to solve some of the basic social problems.